I'm guessing all of you MySQL users. Who doesn't use MySQL here? Really? What do you use? Hmm. Okay. Excel. There is a book actually by, I think, Packet Publishing that says using Excel as your database, which allows you to export CSVs into MySQL or Mariadb. I remember seeing this book about 10 years ago. I don't know if it's still available. You can go to Amazon and check it out. Anyway, I'm Colin. I've worked in the MySQL ecosystem for more than 10 years, maybe 12 or 15 years. I've been a user since 2000. I've worked at various companies, all of the MySQL related companies except Oracle or Percona. I also won the Community Contributor Award of the Year last year. I'm not as animated as I usually am because I just came here half an hour ago. I came from Tokyo to and all the way to here via a very convoluted route. So bear with me. I'll be better tomorrow for the other talk. MySQL is a really mature ecosystem. It's been around for 20 years now. Percona server has been around for 7 years. They actually started patching for about that long. MariaDB officially has been around for 5 years. A little longer if you count the fact that we obviously made a beta release a little bit before. Drizzle was around for a couple years, but it's currently dead. Webscale Sql looks really interesting and has been around for about a year and has got a lot of users backing it. Now, out of curiosity, how many of you have not heard of Drizzle? Okay. How many not heard of Webscale Sql? Okay. MariaDB? Percona server? And you obviously haven't heard of MySQL. Okay. So we start off obviously with a history lesson. It started in 1979, long before I existed. It was a text UI to ISAM data store called Unireg, where rows were written to disk and the indexes were available on top of that. And then in 86, there was Unireg on Unix. And this is basically forms to enter data. And if you use MySQL often, you will realize that in the data directories in varlib MySQL, you will see something called .frm files. And FRM files are basically form files. They came from there. MSQL kind of was freely available and not open source and came around that time. And Monty, the creator of both MySQL and MariaDB, Michael Monty Widenius, decided to actually write a plugin for ISAM data stored to MSQL. And when he realized that was actually not going to work out too well, he decided that MySQL would make a lot more sense. And in 1995, around May, actually, like late May, MySQL 1 was released. And this was now not run by Monty's old company. Now, Monty had a couple old companies, Tech something and Monty Program AB. But this was also when MySQL AB was incorporated in Sweden. 96 brought along 319. But I'm guessing a lot of the early internet started using that. So sites like Slashdot. People still visit Slashdot? No? Oh, yes. One person. Excellent. Everybody else probably moved to, I don't know, Hacker News or something. But Slashdot used to run a lot of early MySQL with Perl. And in 2000, it's probably when more and more people started using it because that's when you got a GPL MySQL server. But not only did you get a GPL MySQL server, it was also basically the creation of what is currently known as a dual license piece of software. MySQL was probably the first one to come up with a dual license piece of software. And for a company that was pretty small, GPLing the entire server back then was actually a pretty risky thing to do because how do you make money? So as I said, dual licensing came along, and libmysql was also GPL. And this actually had a point of contention where many Linux distributions were occasionally shipping MySQL back then, and they would not want to switch client libraries from the LGPL client library to the GPL client library. And this obviously is important because protocols change over time, and we needed people to start shipping more modern releases, the GPL libmysql. And that's short, and a few years later, there was this thing known as the false exception. So that is how distributions ended up moving to a GPL libmysql as opposed to sticking with the old LGPL libmysql. False exception basically says, look, if you're using this for free and open source software and you link to it, no worries. If you'd like very much to have commercial software, please call MySQL for a license. And when we started selling licenses, we were easily getting about 60% of our revenue from OEM license fees. This revenue obviously declined over the years, but there were many, many products that shipped libmysql, including Cisco routers, where the Federated X engine was written for. Adobe digital asset management for Photoshop and other software were using this. And in fact, if you want to know how to actually make use of libmysql, there's a pretty good book by Apress called Expert MySQL, and the author, Chuck Bell, is actually in the audience. Probably needs to update the book. But there's a second edition coming out. Okay. Already out. Okay, so congrats. Today, 2 second editions I learned about. This is brilliant. So that was actually a pretty good book on using the client libraries. And then and then came May 2000, where 3.23 came out, and 3.23 is actually a pretty important release for us. We will never forget this release because many people said this was what made MySQL. We got statement-based replication, and that was actually pretty cool. The rumor has it took a couple of weeks to write statement-based replication, where you actually have statements being written to a log and then replayed on a slave. But this gave you read replicas, just kind of handy. Now, I know Bruce from earlier very well, not to diss Postgres in any way, shape, or form, but they only got replication out of the box in about September 2010. Before that, you had to hack up things like Sloaney and stuff. So MySQL had a good 10-year gap in terms of replication, which is what made it spread everywhere. 3.23 is probably one of the most famous releases. It's been around for a long time. Funnily enough, I hear people still run it. It's not supported in any way, shape, or form, except from a few support companies. But yes, it still does get run. And then you probably realized that we had this MyISAM engine that did not do transactions. So a third-party company called Innobase actually created the InnoDB storage engine that brought along transactions, multi-version concurrency control. It made MySQL kind of a real database. Previously, people used to say this was a toy database. In fact, if you go read the old docs on atomic operations, today, you might actually get a good laugh because today we support atomic operations. We didn't back then, and we wrote wonderful marketing messages to work around atomicity. In 2001, it also brought the first round of venture capital money and a formal CEO in the form of Martin Mikos, whom took the company from basically GPL to an exit. 2002 is when MySQL actually sued Progress Newsphere over this Gemini storage engine. And if you're interested in this Gemini engine, there's actually still a launchpad tree called Amira that's kind of a rebase of this engine. It never really went anywhere. It was also one of the first tests of the GPL in the courts. And the courts proved that the GPL is actually enforceable. So Gemini became open source, but was eventually abandoned by these folk at Newsphere. We took on Series B in 2003, and that actually helped us ramp up engineering quite a bit. In fact, that was a good thing with the Series B money that came, is that engineering started growing. And when I say engineering started growing, I literally mean like if you contributed code, like you wrote a connector, you wrote any remote patch, you'd most likely get a MySQL person contacting you saying, "Hi, would you like a job?" This also happened if you hung out on hash MySQL IRC, helping people. That's how we got a lot of our early support staff and so forth. So we were just expanding the company by hiring any contributor to MySQL. And then we released 4.0 GA. But at the same time, we were very ambitious by releasing 2 alpha releases. We said, look, 4.1's coming, and there's the next release. Why did we do that? Because we also had this SAP partnership. And SAP said, look, we're enterprise software. We don't want people to buy Oracle licenses. We wanted to be bootstrapped with MySQL. Now, MySQL didn't have all these wonderful features like triggers and views and so forth, or explains for inserts, updates, deletes for DML ops, which SAP actually needed. This is also when we toyed around with this Maxdb database, which is actually entirely written in Pascal. Max is Monty's second child, his only son. Mu, the My, is his first daughter. So we tried very hard to make MySQL enterprise ready. And around the same time, we also acquired Alzato from Ericsson, and these were the people that made NDB Cluster. And it's pretty hard today to find a single source where your cell phone doesn't contact a home location recorder and actually connect to NDB Cluster. Most of the operators today actually end up using that. And NDB Cluster actually gives you basically 5 nines worth of uptime. Funnily enough, many people were talking about NoSQL databases for a very long time after 2009. But NDB was actually already a NoSQL database in 2003. It didn't have a SQL interface. You could actually write directly to the NDB API. The SQL interface was actually tacked onto it later. So, October 2004 brought us a 4.1 GA, including NDB cluster. So this was a very good selling point because now we could sell it to lots of telcos. And formerly, the name of the product became known as MySQL Cluster. 2005 brought on the 5.0 tree, and it was currently the focus of development. Lots of rapid changes were going through it. It was nowhere near ready, but we had to release it. Why? Because in October of 2005, Oracle acquired Innobase. This can be viewed today as one of Martin's biggest failures, not acquiring Innobase. In fact, Heike always wanted to work at Oracle. That was his main goal. Heike Turi was the author of InnoDB, and he shortly said, look, I can now buy myself a nice Porsche, and I get a VP title at Oracle. And he's been very happy since. I believe he still is at Oracle and occasionally teaches at the university. So after InnoDB Friday, which is a very dark day for everyone at MySQL, we were very worried what would happen. We released 5.0 as GA. We said, we must release a GA. It was unfortunately a terrible release. It had a broken ABI, the application binary interface. Linux distributions were complaining. It had a lot of enterprise features, though. We finally got things like stored procedures, views, triggers. And it turns out that this release was very marketing driven over actually being market driven. In fact, internally, I think it took nearly a year for the bugs and the support eventum system to actually move from 4.1 to 5.0. So it took a while before 5.0 stabilized. So we were growing, but naturally we had problems shipping quality GA code, which is why people always say, oh, if you've got a MySQL release, wait like 9 months before you actually use it in production. And it kind of started around this time. To make matters worse, all the best engineers, the architects of MySQL, kind of decided to go start this Mariadb project. So not work on actually making MySQL better, go and make an engine called Maria, because they needed to actually, kind of make it fully transactional, make it crash safe, and basically replace InnoDB. Now, Maria has now become Aria. The name of the project is MariaDB. Till today, we have up to basically a crash safe Aria, but we don't actually have it fully transactionally aware. So InnoDB is still the engine of choice. Taking on Series C meant that it wouldn't be very long before we'd like to probably IPO. And that also allowed us to acquire Netfrastructure. Netfrastructure was basically a company of two people, Jim Starkey and Ann Harrison. And Jim Starkey, as some of you may know, was the guy that invented the blob concept, the MVCC concepts. And Falcon was the engine that was acquired as part of the Netfrastructure acquisition. And it was really there to solve the InnoDB problem. Now, what is the InnoDB problem? The InnoDB problem is the fact that we used to get this contract with Oracle for like about, was it 18 months, 24 months? And then every month, Oracle would give us a code drop of InnoDB, which one engineer would integrate. And that meant we could not actually work on InnoDB. The InnoDB development was done elsewhere. At the same time, we thought, why don't we open up the engine interface? Since we want more competition in this space, let's make the pluggable storage architecture available. And at that point in time, we were about the only database that supports it. Today, you have another database called MongoDB that has a pluggable storage engine. And a lot of people that have written storage engines for MySQL also are writing storage engines for MongoDB. Around the same time, the cluster team realized that they needed to actually move development forward. So they actually forked MySQL. They had their own little tree where they would include things like row-based replication, online DDL operations, and all of this was in the cluster fork. Cluster eventually merged back into the trees under Oracle stewardship, so kudos. But before that, it was actually a fork tree. And there was also PBXT, another engine by a third party, mostly a guy called Paul McCullough. It's clipping after we shared it. I don't know why. And it was basically log-based, and it had a lot of promise because it was actually doing a lot of operations potentially faster than InnoDB because it was written in 2006, not 2001. You had a lot more modern hardware. There was a lot more 64-bit hardware around. And I, argue that it pushed InnoDB forward because the next couple of years, InnoDB improved tremendously, largely because many people thought that, maybe we'd pick up PBXT along the way. And InnoDB improved tremendously under Oracle stewardship. And if we digress a little, what really does make engines different? And I thought I'll list down like pretty much everything that makes an engine different. It could be how the data is stored on disk or in memory. It could be the types of indexes it uses. Some use B plus trees, some use hash indexes, and so forth. It could be how it uses memory. Not all engines come with transactions, though today really you probably only want to use a transactional store. Locking levels, there were table locks, InnoDB has row locks, and we used to ship this engine up to 5.0 called the BDB storage engine, and that used to have page locks. Data types, caching, so MyISAM makes active use of the operating system cache, whereas InnoDB has its own buffer pool. Full text search capability, MyISAM was the only engine that had it, and then InnoDB in 5.6 brought it along as well. GIS support. So if you want R-tree index support, only MyISAM and ARIA could actually have R-tree index support. And InnoDB 5.7 has this as well. So InnoDB is getting better in a way to replace MyISAM. Also not listed on this slide are two other things. And if you can guess, I will buy you a beer or a beverage of your choice at the bar later. What are the two other things that are not on this slide? I know it's small. There was no other way to cram it in. A hint? Well, it involves the fact that some things are done in the server and not exposed to, and not done in the server and should be done in the engine. Anybody? Free beer? Okay. No free beer. I save money. Backups are different. So in ODB, you have things like extra backup and online backup. MyXAM, you have use dump, and TalkyDB has their own sort of backup solution. You can use LVM snapshots. Backups are not handled in the server. That was a plan for MySQL 6, which never really saw the light of day. And the other thing that's different is the fact that foreign keys are also implemented within the engine, not in the server layer. So engines like InnoDB support foreign keys. TalkyDB, even though written today, does not support foreign keys. 2 beers. Backup is cheating? Why? Online backups. And the reason I bring up backups is because we actually did release a 6.0 tree. You can find a 6.0 tree with online backup capability for at least MyXAM somewhere on Bazaar, or maybe someone. It's not in the official trees anymore, but people have backed it up. Exactly. So, and it's a shame that it never really saw the light of day and was ripped out, and it actually mostly worked. Another guy called Greg Leahy wrote a lot the design docs behind it as well, and yeah, sad. So at that point in time, we also started working on the 5.1 tree. 5.1 was not GA during 2007, largely also because 2007 was kind of a quiet period year for us. When you want to file for IPO, you can't really go rah rah rah, hey, we're doing all this cool stuff. And due diligence for Sun started around late November, and by I think January 18th, they bought us for $1 billion. Only the VCs and some executives got rich. The rest of the developers don't think really got hugely rich. Yes, we got some money. We did get a shot glass, and some of us got money depending on when you joined. You joined a little later, but yes, $1 billion, one of the largest open source exits of its time, which also probably spurred like the next 60 other NoSQL databases to get funding. If MySQL could do it, why can't we? Yeah. Also, after Sun bought us, a group of people decided to start this thing called the Drizzle Project. They said, look, the 6.0 tree has got some cool stuff, but we need to actually make it a lot more modular. We need to make it faster. We need to learn about continuous integration so we don't include features that are actually not going to make it or break when we release it. They wanted a microkernel architecture. It was led by Brian Aker, the then CTO of MySQL, and he decided to announce this at OSCON. Like, it was supposed to be a surprise. Like, hey, we're doing this. Like, and Sun doesn't even know. But it turns out Sun didn't want to fire them. Sun said, oh, we think this might be a good idea. Let's bring you all under the CTO office and work on Drizzle. Martin, who was the SVP back at Sun then, was obviously very pissed. And then he decided a smart thing for us to do was to release in November 2008 a 5.1 GA. And Monty made a famous blog post about this. Like, it was a long list of why 5.1 should not be GA. And then he listed all the bugs in it. So can you imagine how the marketing people felt? Like, what is wrong with you? Yeah, he did not approve of the release. But you can kind of tell why. So if you follow the timeline carefully. Also late 2008, we started seeing R Delta out of Australia. Aryan Lens was running this. He started making binaries. And then Percona server came along as well. And this is largely to do with the fact that we had this flawed idea that we would make these enterprise binaries. I did not mention proven scaling, but they're a company that also came and went in between. They would actually, these enterprise binaries would be behind a paywall, and they would actually subscribe, download the enterprise binaries, and give them away for free. Proven scaling was Jeremy Cole and Eric Bergen. Eric now works at Facebook. Jeremy now works at Google. But I'd like to bring you to this graph here. I don't think the marketing people like Edwin like me very much for blogging about it either. But it turns out that Percona they had released many servers. They had called a Percona SQL release. They then called it the Percona Hyperf release, and they also had a Percona server. And in 2009, this graph is actually from Flickr. Flickr actually upgraded to the Percona Hyperf builds, and you will see that they were starting to get a lot more lower usage of I/O when they migrated. And I also point to that blog post because you'll actually notice that there were many patch sets already. Wikipedia was running a 4040 patch set, and Domas Mituzas, who was back then a MySQL support engineer who also now works at Facebook, had a Wikipedia patch set. And you'd see comments from people like Mark Callahan, which also talk about the 104 InnoDB plugin. InnoDB used to have a built-in engine and a plugin. And basically, there were multiple background threads available for native AIO. And Google and Facebook really pushed MySQL development forward as well. And Percona put a lot of those patches in. So you could actually make the number of threads for the readers and the writers configurable as well. So lots of improvements pushed by web scale companies. So remember that timeline. November 2008, 5.1 becomes GA. February 2009, Monty leaves Sun. Suspicious. He leaves Sun not with much of a plan to do much besides work on the Maria engine in his spare time. At this point in time, he made at least 1/4 of the same amount of money David made. Why 1/4? Because he had a ex-wife and 2 kids who got the rest of the money. So, also in March 2009, we had the final alpha release. And why do things always get released around March or April? Because we have this traditional conference called the MySQL Users Conference that happens in April in Santa Clara. And it's being reincarnated as the Percona Live MySQL Santa Clara Conference. Then, in April 2009, the day of the conference, Oracle actually releases a public statement saying they're going to acquire Sun Microsystems. We're all sitting there in the hotel going, is this a joke? But it's not, because the next day, this chap from Oracle, Ken Jacobs, actually comes to talk about how they would like to integrate MySQL. But this doesn't happen for quite some time because the EU gets involved. Monty informs the EU that this might be an anti-competitive move. So it takes many, many months before the sale actually completes in January 2010. But in the meantime, Monty Program AB actually starts, and Mariadb is being actively worked on. So I'd say around April, so that same time, I remember a guy called Hakan basically said, hey, I'm leaving this company. I need to go do something. He joined Monty Program to do benchmarks, and Daniel was also early Monty Program employee. I had some handcuffs that I had to wait on for, and then I got the chicken pox. Also, at this point in time, Falcon is dead. Drizzle is generally not looking too promising because Oracle has InnoDB. You don't need Drizzle. And oh yeah, another good thing to actually mention about Monty Program is that it had this idea of the hacking business model in where everybody were equal. You were given a VIP number, and the amount of hours you worked basically times your VIP number would equal the amount of ownership of the company you actually ended up having. It's a very egalitarian business model, and it's kind of nice because all the employees are now not really employees, but they're co-owners of the company. And this kind of makes a difference later on. As Monty actually wanted to do right by the developers who did not get money from the sale. 2009, October, brought along a beta release of Mariadb. Largely, a lot of time was spent working on the build system, improving test cases, and learning from Drizzle, actually, removing compiler errors and so forth. So this was like a 5.1 cleanup. Working on upgrades from 5.0 to 5.1 was important too. And then a GA release came on in February 2010. At this point in time, Oracle had, just acquired Sun and were ingesting MySQL. And Mariadb was kind of on fire. In November 2010, we had our first ever community release where we included things like virtual columns, authentication plugins, and so forth. And we'd done 2 releases that year, and we had goals that said we'd like to release every 9 months, 6 to 9 months following Linux distributions. Those are good goals to have when you start out. Then December 2010 came along, and 5.5 GA came, and that at that point in time was actually a really good release. It had huge InnoDB performance improvements, lots of improvements in the code base, and it was starting to look really good. Of course, people didn't migrate immediately. It took them, again, a few months, but it was a huge release. And the next release that came out in this ecosystem would be the Mariadb 5.3 GA. And this was still based on the 5.1 tree that we'd had, or should I say the 5.2 tree, because Mariadb follows the let's merge everything we had in the previous release. So it was 5.2 plus GIS functionality, lots of replication improvements, lots of improvements to the optimizer. And in parallel, we had to work on the 5.5 tree because 5.5 was also, as I said, already released in 2010. And it took, April 2012 before we had 5.5 GA. It was a 16-month gap to get all the patches rebased into the tree. And, at that point in time, it was still easy to measure. If you looked at the significant lines of code, we had about 1.5 million extra lines of code compared to stock MySQL. This was not including engines or test cases. That meant quite an additional amount of features, I guess. Then in November 2012, Monty announced the formation of the Mariadb Foundation, again to be the custodian of the code, so that in the event that Monty program got acquired, the code would still be safe. In February, MySQL 5.6 became GA. And that was about 2+ years to get GA. And this was actually a complete refactor. I would say a lot of history was removed. A lot of the code became a lot more modular, which actually meant it was easy for new people to start hacking on 5.6. But this also meant that a lot of the changes would be very different to go back into merging with Mariadb. So at this point in time, Mariadb decided that the next release would not be a 5.6, but would be a 10. Actually, we'd already decided it was going to be a 10 before 5.6 became GA. I'd say sometime in 2012, we'd already said, look, we want to make 10.0 because there's no number between 5.5 and 5.6. However, we did not expect it would take very long for us to release 10, and 5.6 came out in between. Then, in April 2013, SkySQL AB acquired MoneyProgram AB, and this basically made Mariadb a corporate-backed MySQL variant. However, there was still that foundation thing hanging around. Today, the foundation employs hackers, as does the corporation, and the community also has commit rights. So I'd say that overall, it's not a bad deal. March 2014 brought alongside Mariadb 10.0 GA, and with Mariadb 5.5, we started seeing some people like Wikipedia announce that they would move. And Mariadb 10, I think, pretty much sealed most of the Linux distributions except Debian and Ubuntu in getting it as the default shipped MySQL. And again, kudos to Oracle because they've put a lot of effort. I think there are at least 3 engineers who work on the Debian and Ubuntu efforts on the Debian MySQL team. That is like at least 2 more than we have. So another thing that came out in March, besides Mariadb 10 being GA, is the fact that Webscale was announced. Webscale Sql. There is no GA or shipping release of Webscale. Webscale is meant to be a base. You're meant to check it out at GitHub, compile it, add your own stuff to it. Though there are builds available by a company called PSC, a whole bunch of ex-Percona people left. They left Percona and they started PSC.com and they make Webscale SQL binaries. Also, on the topic of Linux distributions, the moment Oracle got very interested in the Debian and Ubuntu efforts, Percona also got very interested in the Debian and Ubuntu efforts. So you'd actually start seeing that it's also shipped inside Debian and Ubuntu, but not in the other distributions as often. Now, somewhere along the way, one has to mention CodaShip. It's been open source now for about 6 years. They tend to make about 3 releases a year, but they tend to have 2 very popular distributions. And what does Galera cluster really do? MySQL replication, either statement-based or row-based, is asynchronous. There is a semi-synchronous plugin, and that gets better in 5.7 and even Mariadb 10.1. However, Galera cluster promises the idea that you have fully synchronous replication, so all nodes are equal or they roll back. Oracle's got another take on this called parallel replication, and I don't think that's in the 5.7 RC, so it's still a labs release. Is it in the 5.7 RC? Yeah, I think it's in the labs release, and I don't know if it'll make the GA, but we'll see. So PXE is pretty popular. Mariadb Galera cluster is also pretty popular. Now, the reasons why you choose one over the other, maybe you'd like to use Galera alongside something like multi-source replication that Mariadb 10 has. And there are a lot of people that are using Galera today, including HP's DNS as a service. If you read the OpenStack docs, they recommend it. Mercado Libre, PagerDuty, AVG, Greets, greeting card company in the in Europe, migrated from Oracle RAC to Galera cluster. And if you follow Planet MySQL, as you should probably all do, you'd see Morgan Tucker always talk about each and every release and how individual members reported bugs and things got better. We made in the Mariadb team a community release in 5.2. We logged contributions on the knowledge base, but in 10.1 we also are kind of, at least the engineers are referring to it as a community release as well, in where we got a whole bunch of new features from a whole bunch of companies. And not on that slide include people like CodaShip, IBM for the Power 8 work that they've contributed, and also Oracle for things like default temp storage engine, Union All, and the optimizer. The ecosystem is really, really vibrant at sending features back to us. What about the open source community as a whole? External committers. Now, MySQL has traditionally never really had external committers because MySQL hired every external committer that was available. And I say that Oracle didn't really make any difference. I mean, neither did Sun. Generally, I believe there are security reasons why external committers don't exist. Though I think 5.7 had a pretty good thing in the form of generated columns from Andrei Zhakov. Mariadb also does take contributors, but the way it does it is not via commits. You can't just have a bazaar branch and we won't merge the bazaar branch. We are looking to do that since now we've moved to GitHub. So if you fork the tree and submit a pull request, we are looking to bring pull requests back in. Previously, we've done it by you having a tree, and then we do a manual merge, and then we'll put you in the log of contributions. But the people that can contribute to MariaDB today, if you go to Launchpad, are 25 members of the community, 18 from the corporation, and 5 from the foundation, which is not bad. Webscale. Webscale has Alibaba, Facebook, Google, LinkedIn, and Twitter, with also Percona and MariaDB working on it. So from a MariaDB standpoint, we work on the MyRock storage engine for RocksDB. Percona handles a lot of the merge work for Webscale. And we've all agreed to, work on Webscale for the greater good. We've also got Google Summer of Code participation in MariaDB. Now, we used to have this in the MySQL world as well. We had several projects right up until, I would say, Sun owned us. Once Oracle took over, I think Google and Oracle have some kind of animosity, so no more Google Summer of Code. But the problem was, in the MySQL world, nothing actually ever made it into a shipping release. We had a 5.2 community tree, which I did not talk about. We had actually one engineer called Chad Miller working on it. It had one feature, and that feature has been deprecated in MySQL, but it's actually still available inside of MariaDB. We had a 5.4 tree even, which not many people would probably remember. And we actually had some useful features, like Google Summer of Code back in 2007. A student actually wrote per query variables as a feature. It's been sitting on Launchpad for a long time, and it took Webscale to actually integrate it. Then Percona integrated it. Then, or I believe MySQL 5.7 has it, and then MariaDB has it. But it took such a long gap before the student actually saw shipping code. It's not good for students overall, or anybody. You don't want to write code and then have it shipping in 10 years. You want to write code and have it shipping in like a year. And I'm kind of happy to say that for MariaDB's GSoC, we've had people ship, we've hired people. We've got 8 contributors this time, and I think 7 out of 8 will pass their midterms at the end of this month. But maybe 8 out of 8 will. We'll see. Oracle, when it comes to security, and this is largely policy, there is corporate policy, send out these critical patch updates once every 3 months, or they make releases. So there was an OpenSSL bug that only affected the enterprise release that bumped the release version up pretty quickly. The mem compare issue that I mentioned down there took maybe about a month or so to fix. You see CVEs, you don't really see test cases against CVEs, and largely this has to do with the fact that the idea is that you should not let the hackers actually run against unpatched MySQL. However, it doesn't help the MariaDB and Percona server folk as much. Percona also roughly follows the Oracle release schedule, but does take security fixes from MariaDB, and there's an example that they've taken, and I believe that was for the run up to 300 times, get root access. Bugs, humans. So I really hope Oracle would improve, but I don't think they can because they have a huge org, and this is their security policy to not let other people, run test suites against unpatched servers. A common question I get is MySQL dying? No. Development is really at its most vibrant today. Honestly speaking, people were afraid that Oracle would kill MySQL at the end of 2014. Honestly, Oracle isn't bad. I think they've been putting in a lot of effort. They've been getting a lot of young developers hack on MySQL. We're getting a better MySQL with every release. In fact, we get InnoDB from Oracle. So every time InnoDB gets better, we get a better transactional storage engine. External contributors are increasing. Just look at the Webscale Sql effort. The people using it, as much as the NoSQL is famous, it doesn't really mean much. If you look at the Gartner Magic Quadrant, if that sort of thing floats your boat, you'd see Oracle all the way at the top with MySQL in the leaders quadrant. And last year, Mariadb made it into the leaders quadrant as well. But if you're looking for all the other NoSQL solutions, Enterprise DB is also in the leaders quadrant. But if you're looking for the NoSQL solutions, they're all in the visionary, potential competitor sections, and so forth. So MySQL is not dying. In fact, now I bet you can't really see that very well, huh? In fact, that's the Alexa top 20 websites. And the sites in blue run MariaDB. The sites in pink run Webscale. The sole red site runs, probably SQL Server. It's a Microsoft site. I don't know what they run. And the rest actually run MySQL. So it's a pretty good list of companies that are running MySQL or its ecosystem. Taobao and the Alibaba group, even though they run a Webscale base, also gave us MariaDB multi-source replication, which we're also, which we've been shipping since MariaDB 10. We're also happy to see Oracle come up with a release in 5.7. And there's been work with Amazon. Amazon probably makes the most money from MySQL, probably more money than Oracle, Percona, and MariaDB combined through RDS. And they also have Aurora. I don't know if you've tried it. We can't talk much about it in public, but it's now open to everyone in public. But you still have to sign NDA. What is public, though, is the fact that the Java and ODBC connectors from MariaDB are actually certified to run on Aurora. That was announced sometime in April. When we look at MySQL adoption, we can actually look closely at PopCon in Debian, and you'll see that MySQL Server is like the #1. If we drew a graph, it'll eclipse everything else. But it's then followed very closely by MariaDB Server as well as Percona Server. However, in the Galera cluster space, PXC seems to be doing a little bit better than MGC, and I think it's largely got to do with the fact that it is first to market. PXC came out at least 9 months before MGC. But today you can also gather your own stats from things like the Docker Hub, Juju Charms, Puppet, and so forth. Many systems give you statistics nowadays. They're not like the most accurate statistics, but it's well worth looking at like the Docker registry and stuff to see what adoption kind of looks like. What about the external ecosystem? Yahoo just announced a monitoring tool where they actually make extensive use of performance schema, open source. Yelp is open source, a lot of replication monitoring. Box has tools, Dropbox. Booking has Maxscale in place. Dropbox has been playing around with Fabric for at least a year. People are using all the tools in the ecosystem. This is not like a dying ecosystem as much as anyone would like to tell you it's dying or you should go on some NoSQL bandwagon. In fact, if you needed big data, you wanted to do queries in long-running queries over HDFS. There's a Hadoop applier that's available in the labs release that streams data in real time from MySQL to HDFS. And what about the non-server external ecosystem? Percona Toolkit, Extra Backup, Maxscale, MyDumper, so you can parallel dump and restore. MHA for high availability, written at DNA, currently used at Facebook. Tungsten Replicator acquired by VMware. Vitess. So Google has a sharding solution, automatic sharding solution that they've launched that they've been using for YouTube for some time. They wrote this in Go. And now if you go to vitess.io, you can actually launch this in Kubernetes and have your own sharded MySQL instances. There's also companies like ScaleDB and Scalebase. The people that first made sharding easy was Tumblr. They have a solution called JetPans. They run Percona Server for everything and MariaDB 10 for an aggregation node to make new aggregator nodes for sharding. The MySQL utilities packs like MySQL RPL admin, MySQL failover, they're well worth using. Fabric, I honestly don't know production users yet besides Dropbox playing with it, but maybe we will find out more soon. Percona Replication Manager has users. In fact, if I'm not mistaken, GitHub runs PRM, and they had an outage sometime last year, and it was because of automatic failover, which is why automatic failover is not always the best thing for you. Several lines cluster control. Now, Oracle sells a wonderful tool in the in the monitor, and if you ever try to use NDB cluster, try to upgrade it. You get bald pretty quickly, unless that's the style you're going for. Cluster control makes it easy. So does the tool Oracle sells for some amount of money. MMM, don't use it anymore. There's also things like shard query and flex views to actually run parallel queries across multiple shards. Sandbox, huge chunks of GUI tools. Seriously, the non-server external ecosystem is doing well. People are happy. Where are they now? Drizzle kind of died because of the fact that Rackspace employed most of the Drizzle folk, and then they kind of lost interest and said, hey, this OpenStack thing is pretty cool. You should all work on that. Drizzle kind of died. PBXD. Turns out it's really hard to make money selling a storage engine. So Primebase, the company that made PBXD, they do Team Drive now. It's kind of like Dropbox for Teams. Very popular in Germany. Infobrite, they still make a storage engine. They've kind of pivoted multiple times. I think through indirectly, Oracle actually has shares in them because Sun actually invested in Infobrite. InfinityDB, they kind of fizzled out last year. Fizzled out, aka getting bankrupt. So Mariadb Corporation got them. TalkyDB, Percona acquired them this year as well, also in a tough situation. Engines like Nitro, which are kind of popular in the 5.1 days for data warehousing purposes, dead. Kickfire, Schooner SQL, these are all hardware manufacturers who would extend InnoDB to run with like SQL chips basically optimized for an SQL, basically acquisitions. What is the future going to look like? I'm going to bet 5.7 will be GA at Open World this year. Who's with me? Percona server is clear. It aims to never become a fork. It'll actually work closely with Oracle. It's also worth noting that like in the 5.6 release, they'd lagged about 8 months behind the GA. They've already started working on 5.7 from what I can see from the public trees, but that doesn't mean it'll go GA straight after 5.7 goes GA. Mariadb 10 has a lot of rapid changes, especially with things like GTID. It's starting to look a lot more like a fork. It will still remain application compatible. I highly recommend that you try out Mariadb 10.1 because it comes with cool features like encryption and so forth, some of which I'll talk about tomorrow in my security talk. But I also recommend you to try out MySQL 5.7, which is an RC, because you kind of want to report the bugs now, not after it's GA. Because if you report the bugs when it's GA, this is why it takes 9 months to get ready. So use it, try it, break it. Also, it's interesting to note that Webscale announced that they're gonna skip MySQL 5.7. They're gonna be basically backporting interesting features from 5.7 back into their 5.6 tree, and they'll look closely at MySQL 5.8. And they're also willing to give away all their changes under the Apache CCLA if Oracle would accept it, not under the OCA. You're going to ask me, what should you use? And I am going to tell you to think about innovation that happens today. Don't think about innovation that's coming in 2 years' time or 1 year's time. Think about innovation that you can have today. Think about the features you need today, but also look at the roadmaps closely, because roadmaps will help you plan to push the vendor to say, I want X happening in a year. It could be as simple as like, look, we're a bank. We need TLS authentication for everything. You need to start making this happen in 1 year. We're going to migrate, and this needs to happen. Also, you really want freedom from vendor independence, so always generally beware of vendor lock-in. There can be vendor lock-in in open source too. Now, Michael Stonebreaker said that for Facebook, MySQL was a fate worse than death. So they made these funny t-shirts. Now, mastering the MySQL ecosystem is going to take you a long time. 20 years it's been around. So there are lots of wide and varied solutions. There's no one way to do it right, but there are a lot of good resources to help make you get things right. For one, there are a couple of good books. High Performance MySQL. It's a little outdated now. It covers up to 5.5, but it's still really a very good book. MySQL High Availability. I believe Chuck did co-write that. So It's also in the second edition. I think I might have even tech reviewed that book. I did, okay. So that's another good book. And if you're actually looking to play around with Fabric, I highly recommend you getting that book. I think the book has a lot of good examples around Fabric compared to what you can find online. The latest book that's come out is Learning MySQL and Mariadb by Russell Dyer. It's most current because it came out like in April, so it covers up to Mariadb 10, MySQL 5.6. So another book worth buying. And with that, I'd say thank you. And do you have any questions? So thank you for listening. Any questions? Yes. Do you think it's going to be earlier? Yeah, I would totally bet a beer for the 5.7G. I think it'll come out right before Open World or at Open World. What do you think? I don't think it can come out much later. I mean, I was thinking it might even come out like February, you know, like this year, like this was kind of the 2-year mark. But I think Open World is a good time for it. So yeah, I would totally bet a beer, and if we don't see each other until next year here, then that's what the beer would be. We could ask the Oracle employees sitting here, but they can't comment, I bet, as well. Yes, it's GA when it's ready. Oh, MariaDB 10.1 will GA like August or September. Realistically, September. Right before Open World, yeah. Yeah, exactly. So, and Percona server is, you know, when they deem it, you know, 5.7 is GA. Okay, then. Thank you very, very much for listening.
Your customers rely on your website or application. If it's slow or non-responsive, it infuriates your users and costs you money. Keeping your business-critical systems humming along requires insight into what they're doing. Your system metrics tell stories that can reveal performance bottlenecks, resource limitations, and other problems. But how do you keep an eye on all of your system's performance metrics in real time and record this data for later analysis? Enter Longview, the new way to see what's really going on under the hood. The Longview Dashboard lets you visualize the status of all your systems, providing you with a bird's-eye view of your entire fleet. You can sort by CPU, memory, swap, processes load, and network usage. Click a specific system to access its individual dashboard, then click and drag to zoom in on choke points and get more detail. Comprehensive network data, including inbound and outbound traffic, is available on the Network tab, and disk writes and free space on the Disks tab, while the Process Explorer displays usage statistics for individual processes. The System Info tab shows listening services, active connections, and available updates. Adding Longview to a system is easy. Just click the button, copy the one-line installation command, then run the command on your Linux system to complete the process. The agent will begin collecting data and sending it to Longview. Then the graphs start rolling. Use Longview to gain visibility into your servers, so when your website or app heats up, it stays up.
Citrix Zen Server gives you everything you need to integrate, manage, and automate a virtual data center, all on an enterprise-class, cloud-proven virtual platform, and at a third of the cost of other solutions. But why even bother with virtualizing your server infrastructure in the first place? Well, let's say you have a traditional one-server-to-one application architecture, but you're running out of resources and performance is suffering. Once you order new server hardware, you'll wait for delivery, configure it, install your business application, stage and test the server, and finally, add it to your production farm. If you've been through this process before, you know it can take weeks or even months. You also know it's a manually intensive process that will burden your team every time you outgrow your current setup. With a virtual server solution, you could accomplish all of that in less than half a day. Server virtualization software separates the OS and application from the underlying server hardware. And with multiple virtual machines on a single server, you can use each of them to run different OSs and applications. This makes it possible to move your virtual machines from one piece of hardware to another whenever you want, to maximize utilization, simplify maintenance, or recover from a hardware failure, and without slowing down your applications or users. Clearly, server virtualization provides big benefits, and Citrix Zen Server provides even more. Since it's built on an open platform, Zen Server plays well with your existing hardware, storage systems, and IT management software, as well as with the industry's leading cloud service providers. Best of all, you can get started by downloading a fully functional, production-ready version of Zen Server for free. After a 10-minute installation process, you'll see how easy it is to start virtualizing your workloads and automating your IT management processes. And when you're ready for a richer set of management tools, just upgrade to one of the premium editions of Zen Server. So whether you're interested in virtualizing servers for the first time, expanding your server virtualization footprint, or moving server workloads to the cloud, download and install Zen Server today and see how it can help you simplify your IT environment. Citrix Zen Server. Do more. Don't spend more.